Greetings, students, and happy chapter number 5 of nutrition. So as I said, we're continuing to talk about the 3 big macronutrients. The second one we'll talk about here is lipids, or fat. Okay, it should be a little shorter than last week's or last time's chapter. All right, lipids, fat. Basically what we're saying here is that think of when you eat a steak or when you eat something that is solid, right? Fats are typically, our fats here are solid, and that texture of the steak and the smell of it and everything about it, fat gives us a lot of those things. Fat gives us the aroma, the texture, the flavor, the goodness, if you will. Doesn't taste like sugar, right? But it tastes really good, and that's fat, right? Unlike what we just talked about was our carbs, fats, for every 1 gram of fat, how many kcals do we get? The answer is 9. So we said for every 1 gram of fat, it equals 9 kcals, which means you get more calories per gram of fat than you will of carbohydrate and protein, for that matter. Right? So recommended daily intake. So most of us, for our diet, we should be looking to get about 20 to 35% of our total calories for the day from fat. So fat's not a bad thing. It's not the enemy per se. We'll talk about the different types of fat that might be concerning, and then going over that recommended amount is not something we want to do. Typically, we're in that range. Surprisingly, over the last 40 years, or the last few decades, we found that Americans actually have declined their intake of fat in their calories. And again, our intake of sugar has greatly increased. But as far as fat goes, we're okay there. Right, hidden fat. What we want to show you here is how you can take something like the simple potato, which is wonderful, right? I love baked potatoes. So baked potato, 145 calories, right? 0.2 grams of fat. However, if you look at taking that potato and then making French fries out of the potato, you're looking at some very different numbers, aren't you? You're looking at those kcals, more than doubling to 312 kcals and 17 grams of fat. And what we say here is that what's happened is it is the cooking process that has changed the chemical makeup of this potato, if you will. We took a simple potato in its natural state is very healthy for you, right? But when you take that and you fry it in oil and you do some other things to it, then you really change everything about it. And so that's what we need to be aware of, is how we cook food really alters how food is processed in our body. Right, triglycerides, which is, some of the fat that we'll talk about here. As I mentioned before, there is some chemistry involved in nutrition, and I don't want y'all to freak out, but there are some chemical reactions that are going on within us, and it's amazing actually to think that our body is so almost super smart to know how to do all these things. But we're not going to really delve into the specifics of all the chemistry, but you do need to probably gain some understanding. When we talk about a triglyceride, we really mean it's composed of 3 fatty acids, and then you add on a glycerol to the end. Fatty acids, when we talk about fatty acids in general, we're really talking about our fats, right? And fatty acids are really characterized by how long they are, because that then determines how they are broken down or converted in the body. And you see from this slide here that, as I said, eating fat in general is not a bad thing. We need it. It's the types that we're talking about. And in general, it is much healthier to have unsaturated fatty acids than saturated fatty acids. That's why if you look on your labels, a lot of times they'll have that. They'll say fat, total fat, and then it will say saturated fat, right? Because that is a big number, or a number you need to be aware of when we're talking about saturated fats. We're talking about, again, our red meat, our beef, our butter, our cheeses. These things are, have quite a bit of saturated fat in them. And then on our unsaturated fats, we'll talk more about like our oils. Some of our oils are olive oil, which I like to use extra virgin olive oil, peanut butter, things like that, nuts and avocados. They have fats in them, but they're a little healthier fats for you. Saturated fatty acids or saturated fat has a single bond between its carbon atoms, and this is what makes it to be in that solid state at room temperature. So again, a steak or something that is solid, it's not liquid, right? Saturated fats, and these are the ones we want to maybe limit. Unsaturated fats or unsaturated fatty acids are a little different, right? So they contain some carbons and they don't have that saturation with the hydrogen, right? As far as chemically what we're talking about. Some of our unsaturated fats, like I said here, these omega-3 and omega-6 have been shown to have some good properties for us. A lot of people will actually take supplements, pills that contain omega-3 and omega-6. A lot of our fishes have those two different, good vitamins and minerals in there for us, right? But consuming these foods helps actually protect us against heart disease, whereas consuming our saturated fats actually contributes to heart disease. Trans fatty acids or our trans fat, again, this is something we have processed and created by converting it through this hydrogenation process. And that process has created these trans fatty acids. And a big part of what we see are kind of where these comes from. Let's see, I'm trying to think of the different processes we could talk about. But our concern here is that these partially hydrogenated oils is what we want to avoid, because this is where these trans fatty acids are most abundant. Again, we've created this process of creating these partially hydrogenated oils. And if you look at some peanut butters, if you look at a lot of cookies, different things on the packages, you're going to see that. You're going to see partially hydrogenated oils, and we're trying to get away from that type of food processing. Remember, we said it's always best to have foods in their natural state, but even if we don't always look at the natural state, this is kind of one of those processes you want to avoid. Right, you can look here and look at the different types of foods and how much they have of that saturated fat, that monounsaturated fat, omega-3 and omega-6. Sterols. Sterols refer to the liquid that we find in fats in our plant and animal-based foods, right? And so cholesterol is probably what we think of when we think of this liquid fat, and it's the most common one there is. But it's kind of like sterol is the big group, and cholesterol is one of the types of sterols, right? So cholesterol is a type of sterol. It's only found in animals, and our body can also make it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what it is, they do not dissolve well in water, right? So they don't dissolve well in water. So think about that. Think about fat in general. If you drop some fat globules on a glass of water, it kind of sits right at the top, right? It's not going to want to mix in with that water. But we need cholesterol, right? 90% of cholesterol in our body is found in our cell membranes, meaning our cell membranes need to be lubricated. Think of it that way, right? This cholesterol provides this film that is really good for our cells, and we need it. Right, good sources of cholesterol. So again, your eggs, your meat, and your fish are good sources. If you look on this slide here, you'll see beef liver, salmon, a lot of different things here are good for you when we talk about cholesterol. So how does our lipid or fats digest and get absorbed into our body? Well, the one thing is, unlike some of our carbs, fat is really good about being processed in our body. That's good and bad, right? So most of our absorption, kind of like of our fat, happens in our small intestine, and what we need bile. So remember, think of that fat as something that's kind of solid, or even if it's a liquid, it doesn't want to mix up with water or other things. So we need bile, which is kind of an acid, right? We need some of these enzymes and bile to kind of attack all that fat in order to be super strong to break it apart. And so that's what happens here. We'll talk, our liver and our pancreas all contribute the necessary bile and enzymes to break down all that fat. And so most of that fat is kind of processed or digested in our small intestine, right? And then, so we get that, and then there's another process that we could kind of go into, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you can read here about how then that fat is broken down and then absorbed into, again, our bloodstream, our lymph nodes, and our cells, right? Which we really need. since our small intestine does such an awesome job of breaking down that fat, we don't lose a lot of fat. So the fat that you eat, you're going to keep it on. And we can talk about different ways you'll keep it on, but you're going to keep it, right? And so the body is really good at processing fat. Unlike last time when we talked about carbohydrates and we talked about complex carbohydrates or insoluble fiber, right? Those are things that are hard for the body to process. Fat's pretty easy for the body to process. And it also, remember, gives us that 9 kcal per gram instead of 4. Lipoproteins, we'll talk about that. We need this lipoprotein in order to kind of carry or attach to that fat to get it moving and get it to the cells that need that. Most of us have heard of cholesterol in general, and a lot of us understand there's a difference in what we call LDL and HDL cholesterol. And so, again, our liver, our organ, the liver, is able to make or manufacture cholesterol on its own. LDL is what we call a low-density lipoprotein. And what this LDL does is it kind of gets that, it gets that cholesterol and it takes it to our heart, right? So if we look here, we see LDLs are known as bad cholesterol because it takes the cholesterol and it takes it to your arteries or to your heart. And then again, we'll see in a minute how we don't want to have those fats collecting in our arteries because that's what eventually leads to a heart attack, right? So in that sense, LDLs are what we call bad cholesterol. On the opposite, we have HDL. HDL stands for high density lipoproteins. And what HDL does is it kind of transports cholesterol the other way. And so HDL transports cholesterol here to our liver to basically be excreted out or to leave our body. So instead of taking cholesterol to the heart and then depositing it there, which is not a good thing for our heart and arteries, it takes it away and gets rid of it for our body. So that's why when we take your blood levels and we look at cholesterol, doctors are also usually giving you some statistics or numbers on what is your HDL and what is your LDL. So for the test, you want to know high levels of HDL in the blood are associated with a reduced risk of heart disease, which is good. All right, lipid functions in the body. So most of our lipids are going to go to what we call adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is body fat. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you see there's some good things that come with adipose tissue. It's kind of like our insulation, right? Keeps our body insulated. It's where we store the excess calories or energy for when we need it later, right? The problem is going to be if we have too many excess calories or energy, then we get to being overweight. So when energy or kcals are ingested in excess amounts of need, so if you need 2,000 calories a day and you're eating 3,000 calories a day, that's what we're talking about. The excess of those calories or energy is converted into triglycerides and it's stored in body fat. This is where sometimes we would think of your rolls of fat, right? That's adipose tissue. It's not muscle, it's fat tissue. Bile can help that fat and water mix together, because remember we said fat doesn't want to mix with water, by breaking down those big globules or big round things and making them into smaller ones. So as I mentioned before, our liver makes bile, and that liver making bile, that bile is what helps to break down that fat, and it's really good at it. Essential fatty acids. Essential fatty acids are not synthesized or made by the body. So think of the word essential, right? When something is essential to you and I, it means we have to have it, right? And so that's what these are. So essential fatty acids means my body can't make it. I have to eat it. I have to get it in my nutrients in some way for my body to use it. As we see here, it's important for growth, skin, fertility, the way that our structures maintain their shape and their form, right? This is all the reasons we need essential fatty acids in our diets. We're talking about here, I'm not going to go into detail about how we get energy from triglycerides, because those triglycerides essentially produce ATP, we mentioned a while in another chapter. ATP is really important because it is the way that we get that energy from our nutrients, right here. And there's a big difference between when our body is eating a lot of calories and when our body is what we call fasting or starving itself. When we're feasting or we're eating a lot of calories, when we get excess energy is consumed, right, we store that fat as triglycerides in our adipose tissue. Then when let's say you go to sleep at night, you have your last meal of the day, you go to sleep at night, all night your body is now fasting. It's not getting any type of nutrients, right? So when no food has been eaten, then what happens is your body takes those triglycerides from the adipose tissue and it breaks it down to use it as an energy source, right? So this is all good. This is what's happening. But again, as I said, why we should be eating first thing in the morning is because your body needs some nutrients to get going. Fats or lipids in cardiovascular disease. 85.6 million Americans suffer from some form of heart disease or cardiovascular disease, right? Heart disease is the #1 killer in America. And what I mentioned before is that there is a small number of us of Americans that your family has a history of genetic heart condition. However, for the majority of us, heart disease is really related to your diet and your lifestyle choices. So whether or not you smoke, whether or not you exercise at all or never exercise, whether or not you consume more calories than you should, what types of calories you're consuming, what types of nutrients you're consuming, all of those things are really important. So what that says is that you and I, we really play a huge role in determining whether or not we have heart disease. Right? Atherosclerosis is really what we call this hardening of the arteries, or it's when that fat deposit gets in the arteries. And kind of maybe see if the next slide is not a picture. Yeah. So here we see, when we think of our arteries, think of a smooth tube, right? We want that smooth tube so blood can freely flow to and from the heart. Unfortunately, when we start to have deposits of fat on these walls of the artery, we start to get some problems. We start to damage those arteries. We start to get, think of plaque on your teeth. Well, there's a film that's going to be plaque on your arteries. As we continue on, we're going to actually end up getting bursting blood clots, and those blood clots will lead to clogging up the hole, which means blood and oxygen can't get to the heart. Your heart then is starving and dying, and then we have a heart attack, which is what we want to avoid. Risk factors for heart disease. So all of these different things are risk factors for heart disease. We're focusing on the example 3, and that is high blood pressure. Remember we said when your heart has to work harder to pump that blood through your arteries because they're so clogged up, right? That's a problem. That's a risk of heart disease. Obesity, right? Obesity is a very big, it's correlated with increased risk of heart disease. Diabetes, primarily type 2. So diabetes, again, we have some issues. A lot of our obese patients will tend to also have diabetes type 2. This is for your information when you go to the doctor the next time and you get your blood work done, so you can have an idea of where you should be in the ranges for cholesterol and then for HDL, LDL, triglycerides. So how do we reduce the risk of, developing heart disease? Well, again, focus on foods in their natural state, right? Focus on having, a healthier diet. As I said, fiber, moderate alcohol consumption, the antioxidants, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. The different factors that increase our risk of heart disease: cholesterol, saturated fat versus unsaturated fat, trans fat, sodium. Oh, we are big on salt in our society. Excess sugar, excess energy, meaning excess calories. The Mediterranean diet pyramid here is, a lot of people have talked about, well, I meet people who, sorry about my phone's going off. I don't know how to turn it off here. I apologize. But anyway, people meet individuals who eat the Mediterranean diet and they say, wow, you're so healthy, So if you look at this pyramid, you see the Mediterranean diet really focuses more on grains and fish than it does on meat and sugars. And so looking at that pyramid, you see that meats and sugars play a small role, whereas the American diet might be the opposite. The American diet tends to think of protein as an animal. Remember we said, right, our American diet, we get most of our protein from animal sources. We have chicken, we have fish, we have beef, we have turkey, we have all these different things. And a lot of others in the world, other parts of the world, they get a lot of their protein from plant sources and not animal sources. Dietary fat and cancer. So we see here that when you have a high fiber diet, that can possibly be a reduced risk of cancer. Dietary fat and obesity. So high fat diets contributing to weight gain. So remember, that means we're eating excess calories than what we should be, and we're not expending them. Or you can, like I said, my son, he eats excess calories, but then he works it off, right? So if we're not using them up somehow, it's going to add to our body weight. For the exam, you'll want to know all three of these points here. Fat provides more kcals per gram. So we said fat is 1 gram and it equals 9 kcals. Carbs and protein is 1 gram and they equal 4 kcals. Fat does not provide as much satiety as carbohydrates. Satiety refers to your feeling of being full, right? So when we sit down and we have some beef, right, we like it. Remember, it tastes good, it feels good, there's a good smell, all of those things, and we overeat. As I said, a portion size of beef should be 3 to 5 ounces. Yet when we go eat beef, we typically eat 8 ounces, 12 ounces. We're eating a lot more than we should. And a lot of that is because we don't feel like we're full. And I mentioned fiber. When we eat fiber, it makes us feel full. So we necessarily don't feel like we need to eat something. And then the conversion of dietary fat stored is really efficient. Remember I said our small intestine is really, really good at breaking down and absorbing that fat compared to trying to break down and absorb carbs or other foods. All right, recommended fat intake for your life. You know, pregnant women should have a little more fat. Babies need a lot more fat than we do as we get into adulthood and later adulthood. Calculating the percentage of energy from fat. So this is an important slide and I want to go through it with you together. So get out a pen and paper. As I said, on the exam, there's going to be, you know, some questions, a few, about being able to understand those numbers of for every gram of a macronutrient, how many kcals do you get? And then putting those numbers into a formula here and figuring out the answer. And it's much more simple than it looks. And we're going to go through it together so you have an understanding of that. All right, so look at the bottom example problem. Let's do that together. So the example problem says, which diet provides approximately 22% of the total kcals from fat? All right, the first diet has 75 grams of fat and the total consumed for the day is 3,065 kcals. The second diet has 80 grams of fat and the total kcals for the day is 3,655 kcals. So on your paper, let's do both of them and see which one is the correct answer. Let's look at B first. So B says we have 80 grams of fat. All right, let's go back to the beginning. For every 1 gram of fat, how many kcalories do you get for the 1 gram of fat? I hope you said 9 because that's what we've been talking about in this segment here, 9. So for every 1 gram, we get 9. So if we look at 80 grams of fat, we need to take 80 grams, 80, and multiply it by what? 9. Pretty simple, right? So if you take 80 and multiply it by 9, you should come up with 720. So 720 is the number that we're looking for, the grams, and converting that grams to kcals. So 720 kcals. So in order to find out the percentage of fat though, I take my 720 number and I'm going to divide that by the total calories I had for the day. And then it will tell me what is the percent that my 720 kcals is. So if I take 720 and I divide it on my calculator by 3,655, I get an answer of about 19%. That's pretty close to 22%, right? So that's the kind of long number that I get. Let's do the other problem. If I look at A says 75 grams of fat. So what do? I take the number 75 and I multiply that by what? 9. So 75 times 9 equals 675. So 675 kcals. I take my 675 and I divide it by the calories of that day, the total calories of 3,065. And I should come up with something that is like 22. Right? And you can see 22, bunch of numbers after it, right? So out of A, which is 22, and B, which was 19, the correct answer is A, right? So A was about 22, or exactly 22%. So it was telling me that by having 75 grams of fat with a total calories of 3,065, it meant that for that day, I ate 22% of my calories in fat. Right? And that's how you would figure out this answer. I will tell you there's another example problem at the end of the slides on this chapter. I'm going to let you do that by yourself. So you continue to practice that, right? But you know, when you go to take the exam, this is an online class. You can have the breakdown of this problem or the other problem right in front of you as you go through that process to help remind you of the steps that you should be doing. What about eggs? I love eggs. So eggs have cholesterol. However, they're not that bad for you when you think of the nutrients and protein and vitamins that you get in your eggs, and it has some good cholesterol in them. They used to get a bad rap years ago. I eat eggs almost every day in a different form, but this is my big source of protein. Right, omega-6 fatty acids, safflower oil. Think of, you know, there's different oils that we can use in our cooking and things like that. What we know is that this particular oil really helps to reduce what we call that belly fat, which is something that, you know, we don't want our body to be storing. Lipids and cardiovascular disease, so fat and cardiovascular disease. Think of the acronym or the word PAW, P-A-W. P-A-W stands for pecans, almonds, and walnuts. So if you're somebody who likes kind of the nut family, you're going to see that these here are good for you in reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. Avocados. Avocados are good. They have fat in them, right? But, you know, they have a small enough amount of that the other things that they have really do outweigh it, right? Which of the following describes the quality that the foods add to, quality that fat adds to the food, right? So Americans reduce their percentage of kcals from fat. Reduced fat products taste better than the original? No. High-fat muffins and croissants replace eggs. Fat imparts flavor, aroma, and texture to food. So it's D, right? Because we said that. All right, I'll let you finish the questions on your own because the answers are on the bottom of the slides and you can kind of see that there. I just want to try to keep our conversation a little shorter here. Oh, I think I just saw it right here. Food, yeah, how much fat do we take? Okay, here's a good one for you. So I'm not going to do it for you, but this is a slide that is another practice question. Which of the following is true about heart disease? All right, which has more fat? This is an interesting one. Hamburger, that is 95% lean, and it's only 3 ounces of meat. A beef hot dog. Whole milk, about 1 cup. Which of those 3 do you think has more fat in it? If you said B, the hot dog, you're correct. That meat has the most fat in it. Which has more fat? Non-fat frozen yogurt, vanilla ice cream, a half a cup each, bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit. Gosh, I hope you said C, or 3, I should say. It is that bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit. Which of these 3 has more fat? 2 tablespoons of ranch dressing, 1 ounce of bologna, 1 ounce of potato chips. The answer is actually ranch dressing. Okay. All right. So that's it for kind of our conversation about lipids or fat. Next time, we'll be moving on to talk about our protein. Okay. See you next time.